Okay, we are going straight in to an introductory to the history of psychology, chapter 13, Neobehaviorism. Positivism. As we saw in chapter 5, after several years after Auguste Comte first introduced positivism, the distinction between German physicist Ernst Mach argued for more refined variation. In his contributions to the analysis of sensations, 1886, Mach agreed such British empiricists as Berkeley and Hume asserted that all we can be certain of is our senses. Sensations, then, would form the ultimate subject matter for any science, be it physics or psychology. Likewise, one must not speculate about what exists beyond sensations, nor attempt to determine their ultimate meaning. To do so is to enter a forbidden realm of metaphysical speculation. What a careful analysis of sensations can do is determine how they are correlated. Knowing which sensations go together allows prediction, which in turn allows better adaptation to the environment. For Mach, then, the strong pragmatic reason exists for the systemic study of sensations. In both Comte and Mach, scientific laws are statements that summarize experiences. Both sought, above all, to avoid metaphysical speculation. Both were, in a sense, radical empiricists. Remember that empiricists believe that all knowledge comes from experience. Both argued for a close-to-the-data approach that avoids theorizing about what is observed. Echoing Francis Bacon, both believe that theorizing was most likely induces error into science. Thus, the best way to avoid error is to avoid theorizing. John Watson and the Russian physiologists were positivists, although Pavlov did not engage in considerable speculation concerning brain physiology. All emphasized objective data and avoided or minimized theoretical speculation. Watson's goal of psychology, predicting and controlling behavior, was very much in accordance with the positivistic philosophy. Logical positivism. By the early 20th century, the Comtean and Machian goal of having sciences deal only with that which is directly observable was recognized as unrealistic. Physicists and chemists were finding that theoretical concepts such as gravity and magnetism, atom, force, electron, and mass indispensable, although none of these entities could be observed directly. The problem was to find a way for science to use the theory without encountering the dangers inherent in metaphysical speculation. The solution was provided by logical positivism. Logical positivism divided science into two major parts, the empirical and the theoretical. The observational terms of science refer to empirical events, and the theoretical terms attempts to explain that which is observed. By accepting theory as part of a science, the logical positivists in no way reduce the importance of empirical observation. In fact, the ultimate authority of the logical positivists was empirical observation, and theories were considered useful only if they helped to explain what was observed. Logical positivism was the name given to the view of science developed by a small group of philosophers in Vienna, the Vienna Circle, around 1924. These philosophers took the older positivism of Comte and Mach and combined it with the rigors of formal logic. For them, abstract theoretical terms were allowed only if such terms could be logically tied to empirical observations. His influential book, Language, Truth, and Logic, in 1936, Alfred Ayer, from 1910 to 1989, summarized the position that the logical positivists as follows. The criterion which we use to test the genuineness of apparent statements of fact is the criterion of verifiability. We say that the sentence is factually significant to any given person if and only if he knows how to verify the proposition which it purports to express. That is, if he knows that observations could lead him, under certain conditions, to accept the proposition as being true or reject it as being false. We inquire in every case that observations would lead us to answer the question one way or another, and if none can be discovered, we must conclude that sentence under consideration does not, as far as we are concerned, express a genuine question. However strongly its grammatical appearance may suggest that it does. As we will see, logical positivism has a powerful influence on psychology. It allows much more complex forms of behaviorism to emerge because it allowed theorizing without sacrificing objectivity. The result was that psychology entered into what Conk in 1959 called the Age of Theory. From about 1930 to about 1950, Herbert Feigl, a member of the Vienna Circle, both named logical positivism along with Rudolf Carnap, did the most to bring it to the attention of the U.S. psychologists. Of the American psychologists, S.S. Stevens was among the first to believe that psychology followed the dictates of logical positivism, which he called the science of science. It could be the last to be on par with physics. For this to happen, psychology would need to adhere to the principles of operationism. Operationism and physicalism. 1927. Harvard physicist Percy W. Bridgman, 1882 to 1961, published The Logic of Modern Physics, in which he elaborated on Mach's proposal that every abstract concept in physics be defined in terms of the procedures used to measure the concept. He called this operational definition. Thus, concepts such as force and energy would be defined in terms of the operations or procedures followed in determining the quantity of force or energy present. In other words, operational definitions tie theoretical terms to observational phenomena. In this way, we can have no ambiguity about the definition of the theoretical term. The insistence that all abstract scientific terms be operationally defined is called operationism. Along with the logic of positivism, operationism took hold in psychology almost immediately. Operational definitions could be used to convert theoretical terms like drive, learning, anxiety, and intelligence into empirical events and thus strip them of their metaphysical connotations. Such an approach was clearly in accordance with psychology's new emphasis on behavior. For example, learning could be operationally defined as making X number of successive correct turns in a T maze, and anxiety and intelligence could be operationally defined as scores on appropriate tests. Such definitions were entirely in terms of publicly observable behavior. They had no access mentalistic meaning. Most psychologists soon agreed that the logical positivists that unless a concept can be operationally defined, it is scientifically meaningless. Unlike earlier positivism, logical positivism had no aversion to theory. In fact, one primary goal of logical positivism is to show how science could be theoretical without sacrificing objectivity. Once operationally defined, concepts could be related to one another in complex ways, such as the statements F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration, or E equals mc squared, energy equals mass times a constant, the speed of light squared. Because a scientific theory is evaluated in terms of accuracy of its predictions, it is seen as self-correcting. If the deductions from a theory are experimentally confirmed, the theory gains strength. If its deductions were found to be incorrect, the theory was diminished and had to be revised or abandoned. No matter how complex a theory becomes, its ultimate function is to make accurate predictions about empirical events. By the late 1930s, logical positivism dominated U.S. experimental psychology. One outcome of logical positivism was that all sciences were viewed as essentially the same, because they all followed the same principles, made the same assumptions, and attempted to explain empirical observations. Why should they not use the same terminology? It was suggested that language database be created in which all terms could be defined in reference to publicly observable of physical objects and events. The push for unification of and the common vocabulary among the sciences, including psychology, was called physicalism. The proposal that all scientific propositions refer to physical things had profound implications for psychology. Innocent as the assertion about language may appear, it is changed with far-reaching implications for psychology. In fact, the examples used to illustrate physicalism make it appear that the doctrine was aimed directly against psychology, at least against the kind peddled by philosophers. All sentences purporting to deal with psychical states are translatable into sentences into physical language. Two distinctly separate languages to describe physics and psychology are therefore not necessary. It is the logical positivist way of saying that psychology must be operational and behavioristic. The unity of science movement and physicalism went hand in hand. How we get from physicalism to the thesis of the unity of science is obvious indeed. If every sentence can be translated into physical language, then the language is all-inclusive language, a universal language of science. And if the esoteric jargons of all the separate sciences can upon demand, be reduced to a single coherent language, then all sciences possess a fundamental logical unity. The science that proposed as the model for the unified science was physics. Neobehaviorism. Neobehaviorism resulted when behaviorism was combined with logical positivism. It is only a slight caricature to represent neobehaviorism as a product of the remarriage of psychology in the guise of behaviorism and philosophy in the guise of logical positivism. Logical positivism made many forms of behaviorism possible. Objectivism in data collection is one thing. Agreement upon specific modes of objectivism and about the theoretical implications of objective data was something else. Although there were major differences among the neo-behaviorists, they all tended to believe the following. If a theory is used, it must be used in ways demanded by logical positivism. All theoretical terms must be operationally defined. Non-human animals should be used as research subjects for two reasons. Relevant variables are easier to control than they are for human subjects, and perceptual and learning processes occurring in non-human animals differ only in the degree from those processes in humans. Therefore, the information gained from non-human animals can be generalized to humans. The learning process is of prime importance because it is the primary mechanism by which organisms adjust to changing environments. Most, but not all, psychologists follow the new approach. During the period from about 1930 to 1950, psychoanalysis, see Chapter 16, was becoming increasingly important in psychology, as was Gestalt therapy, which is the next chapter. And psychologists embracing these views saw little need to follow the dictates of logical positivism. Save these expectations, and a few others, however, the varieties of neo-behaviorism dominated the period. Edwin Ray Guthrie. 1886 to 1959, was born in Lincoln, Nebraska, and was the first of 5 children. His father owned a piano shop where he also sold bicycles and furniture. His mother had been a schoolteacher before her marriage. Academically inclined, he tackled Darwin's Origin of the Species and the Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals in the 8th grade and read Xenophon in Greek. Guthrie graduated from the University of Nebraska in 1907 with a BA in mathematics and a Phi Beta Kappa key. After graduation, he taught mathematics at the Lincoln High School while working towards the MA in philosophy at the University of Nebraska. He obtained his MA in 1910 and then started work on his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. After obtaining it, returning in 1912 and teaching high school mathematics. And in 1914, he accepted his position as instructor of philosophy at the University of Washington. And in 1919, he became a member of the psychology department at the University of Washington, where he remained until accepting his position as the dean of graduate school in 1943. In 1951, Guthrie attained emeritus status, but continued to teach and involve himself in university affairs until his retirement in 1956. Guthrie's core work, The Psychology of Learning, was published in 1935 and revised in 1952. His writing was non-technical, humorous, and filled with numerous homespun anecdotes. He believed strongly that any scientific theory, including his own, should be presented in a way that it could be understood by college undergraduates. He also placed great emphasis on the practical application of his ideas. Although he had an experimental outlook and orientation, he, along with George P. Horton, performed only one experiment related to his theory, discussed shortly. Guthrie was clearly a behaviorist, and he argued with other behaviorists like Watson, Tolman, Hall, and Skinner, saying that their theories were unparsimonious and too subjective. Okay. As we will see, Guthrie believed that all learning phenomena could be explained by using only one of Aristotle's laws of association. Guthrie's one law of learning was the law of contiguity, which he stated as follows. A combination of stimuli, which has accompanied a movement will, on its recurrence, tend to be followed by that movement. Note that nothing is here said about conformatory waves or reinforcement or pleasant effects. In other words, according to Guthrie, what you do last in a situation is what you will tend to do if the situation reoccurs. Thus, Guthrie accepted Watson's recency principle. His last publication, before his death, Guthrie in 1959 revised the law of contiguity to read, "What is being noticed becomes a signal for what is being done." This was Guthrie's way of recognizing that an organism is confronted with so many stimuli at any given time that it cannot be possible to form associations with all of them. Rather, the organism responds selectively to only a small proportion of stimuli present, and that proportion then becomes associated with whatever response is made. How we select from the constant abundance of stimuli, we are in fact aware that the problem, abundance of stimuli that we are in fact aware of was a problem Thorndike had first recognized. And as we see, Guthrie was indebted to Thorndike's insights. One trial learning. Learning theorists prior to Guthrie accepted Aristotle's law of contiguity and his law of frequency. Common sense suggests that practice makes perfect. That is, the more we work at a task, cooking, playing a game, learning to ride a bicycle, the better we become. Likewise, Thorndike, Pavlov, Watson, and Tolman, Hall, and Skinner all believed that associative strength increases as a function of increased exposure to the learning environment. Of course, they disagreed in their explanation as to why an increase in associative strength took place, but they all agreed that frequency of exposure was necessary. That made Guthrie's theory of learning unique, was his rejection of the law of frequency, saying instead that a stimulus pattern gains full associative strength on the occasion of its first pairing with the response. In other words, unlike any learning theorist before him, Guthrie postulated one trial learning. As Guthrie was aware, though, Aristotle had observed and learned that learning can result from one experience. Aristotle said, "It is a fact that there are some movements by a single experience of which persons take the impress of custom more deeply than they do by experiencing others many times. Hence, upon seeing some things but once we remember them better than others which we may have seen frequently." However, Aristotle believes such learning to be the exception and learning governed by the law of frequency to be the rule. Why practice improves performance. If learning occurs in one trial, why does practice appear to improve performance? To answer this question, Guthrie distinguished between acts and movements. A movement is a specific response made to a specific configuration of stimuli. It is the association that is learned at full strength after one exposure. An act is a response made to varying stimulus configurations. For example, typing a letter A on a specific typewriter under specific stimulus conditions, such as under certain lighting or temperature conditions or specific bodily position, is a movement. However, typing A under a variety of conditions is an act. It is because learning an act involves learning a specific response under varying conditions that practice improves performance. Just as an act consists of many movements, a skill consists of many acts. Thus, a skill such as typing, playing golf, or driving a car consists of many acts that in turn consists of thousands of movements. For example, the skill of playing golf consists of acts of driving, putting, playing out of sand traps, and the like. Consider just putting. It involves gripping the club, swinging the club, taking the appropriate stance, remaining still, judging the speed, reading the slope, the grain of the green, and among other factors. Assume Guthrie is correct in that learning a movement, such as the firmness of grip, given a particular swing speed, is learned in one trial. It would still require thousands of putts to master the act and skill of putting. Again, it is the fact that acts and skills require the learning of so many SR associations that their performance improves with practice. The nature of reinforcement. According to Thorndike, cats generally become more proficient at escaping from a puzzle box because each time they did, they experienced a satisfying state of affairs, the reinforcement. Guthrie rejected this idea. Guthrie explains that the effects of reinforcement in terms of the recency principle. He noted that when the cat in the puzzle box made the response that allowed it to escape, moving a pole, for example, the entire stimulus configuration in the puzzle box changed. Thus, we have one set of stimuli existing before the pole is moved and another after it is moved. According to Guthrie, because moving the pole is the last thing the cat does under pre-reinforcement conditions, it is that response that the cat will make when next placed in the puzzle box. For Guthrie, reinforcement changes the stimulating conditions, therefore preventing unlearning. In other words, reinforcement preserves the association that precedes it. The only systematic research ever performed by Guthrie was done with Horton, and was summarized in a small book titled Cats in a Puzzle Box. Guthrie and Horton observed approximately 800 escape responses by cats in an apparatus similar to that used by Thorndike. Like Thorndike, Guthrie and Horton observed cats learned to move a pole to escape the apparatus. However, it was observed that each cat learned to move the pole in its own unique way. For example, one cat would hit the pole by backing into it, another would push it with its head, and another would move it with its paws. This stereotyped behavior would be repeated by each cat when replaced into the apparatus. This, of course, supported Guthrie's claim that whatever an animal does last in a situation will be repeated in the situation that reoccurs, the recency principle. The moving the pole, the stimulating conditions, thus preserving the association between the pre-escape condition and the animal's characteristic response to those conditions. Guthrie's claim that reinforcement is merely a mechanical arrangement that prevents unlearning was confirmed. Forgetting. According to Guthrie, not only does learning occur in one trial, but so does forgetting. Forgetting occurs when an old SR association is displaced by a new one. Thus, for Guthrie, all forgetting involves new learning. Forgetting occurs if an existing SR association is inferred with in some way, Guthrie explained. The child who has left school at the end of the 7th grade may recall many of his details of the last year for the rest of his life. The child who has continued on in school had these associations of the schoolroom and schoolroom life overlaid by others, and by the time he is in college may be very vague about the names and events of the 7th grade experience. When we are somehow protected from established cues, we are well aware that these may retain their connection with a response indefinitely. The university's faculty member's wife recently visited Norway, the original home of her parents. She had not spoken Norwegian since the death of her grandmother when she was 5 and believed that she had forgotten the language. But during her stay in Norway, she astonished herself by joining the conversation. The language and atmosphere of her childhood revived words and phrases that she could not remember in her American home. But her conversation caused much amusement among her relatives because she was speaking with a facile Norwegian baby talk. If her family in America had continued to use Norwegian, this baby talk would have been forgotten, its association with the language destroyed by other phrases. Forgetting is not a passive fading of the stimulus-response associations contingent upon the lapse of time, but requires active unlearning, which consists in learning to do something else under the circumstances. Breaking habits. A habit is an act that has become associated with a larger number of stimuli. The more stimuli that elicit the act, the stronger the habit. Smoking, for example, can be a strong habit because the act of smoking has become associated with so many stimuli. According to Guthrie, there are one general rule for breaking undesirable habits. Observe the stimuli that elicit the undesirable act and perform another act in the presence of those stimuli. For Guthrie, it was eating an apple when he would have lit a cigarette. Once this is done, the new desirable act will be elicited by those stimuli instead of the old undesirable act. That's interesting. Punishment. For Guthrie, the effectiveness of punishment is determined not by the pain it causes, but by what it causes the organism to do in the presence of stimuli that elicit undesirable behavior. If punishment elicits behavior incompatible with the undesirable behavior in the presence of these stimuli, it will be effective. If not, it will be ineffective. For example, in attempting to discourage a dog from chasing cars, hitting it on the nose while it's chasing is likely to be effective. On the other hand, hitting it on its rear is likely to be ineffective, perhaps even strengthen the tendency to chase. The formalization of Guthrie's theory. For Guthrie, drives provide maintaining stimuli that keep an organism alive until the goal is reached. Maintaining stimuli can be internal, like hunger, or external, like a loud noise. When an organism performs an act that terminates the maintaining stimuli, the act becomes associated with the maintaining stimuli. That is, because the recency principle, the last act performed in the presence of the maintaining stimuli will tend to be performed when those stimuli reoccur. Such acts are referred to as intentions because they appear to have their goal, the removal of maintaining stimuli, the drive. In fact, however, intentional behavior is explained by Guthrie as the other kind of behavior, that is, by the law of contiguity. And in 1945, Guthrie was elected president of the APA, and in the same year, his alma mater, the University of Nebraska, awarded him an honorary doctorate. And in 1958, the American Psychological Foundation awarded Guthrie its gold medal for distinguished contributions to the science of psychology. Shortly thereafter, the University of Washington named its new psychology building the Edwin Ray Guthrie Hall. Guthrie died of a heart attack, April 1959. Guthrie often presented his ideas in terms too general to be tested experimentally. An effort to make Guthrie's theory more scientifically vigorous was made by Virginia W. Volks in 1921 to 1989, who studied at the University of Washington when Guthrie was influential there. After receiving her BA from the University of Washington in 1943, Volks went to Yale, and she was influenced by Hall. She obtained her PhD from Yale in 1947, and in 1949, Volks moved to San Diego State College, where she remained until her retirement in 1971. Volks' formalization of Guthrie's theory in 1950 consisted of 4 basic postulates, 8 definitions, and 8 theorems, testable deductions. Volks tested a number of her deductions and found considerable support for Guthrie's theory. Another attempt to formalize Guthrie's theory was made by William K. Estes, 1919 to 2011. That's a long life. Good for him. Early in his career, Estes performed significant research on the effects of punishment, 1944. However, it is for his development of the stimulus sampling theory, the SST, that Estes is best known. 1950. The cornerstone of the SST was Guthrie's law of contiguity with its assumptions of one-trial learning. SST showed that Guthrie's theory, while appearing to be simple, was actually quite sophisticated. The model that ST created, SST, effectively dealt with the complexity and launched a highly heuristic research program. ST eventually modified his own theory, making it more compatible with cognitive psychology. Even through its various revisions, however, Guthrie's law of contiguity has remained the core of ST's theorizing. Clark Leonard Hull. Clark Leonard Hull, 1884 to 1952, was born near Akron, New York, a son of an uneducated father and a quiet mother who wed at the age of 15. It was Hull's mother who taught his father to read. Hull's education was in a rural one-room school, which was often interrupted by chores on the family farm, although he still excelled in science and mathematics. After passing a teacher's examination at the age of 17, Hull later taught in the one-room school. or in a one-room school. While in school, Hull contracted typhoid fever. Although several of Hull's fellow students died from the outbreak, he survived, but in Hull's opinion, his memory impaired. After his recuperation, he went to Alma College in Michigan to study mining engineering. Following his training, he obtained a job with a mining company in Minnesota where his task was to evaluate the manganese content of iron ore. After only 2 months on the job at the age of 24, he contracted poliomyelitis, which left him partially paralyzed. At first, he could walk only with crutches, and for the rest of his life, he used a cane. Needing a career that was less strenuous than mining, Hull first considered becoming a Unitarian minister. He was attracted to the Unitarianism because it was a free, godless religion. But the idea of attending the endless succession of ladies' teas caused him to abandon the idea. He really wanted to work in the field that would permit him to tinker with apparatus. I wanted an occupation in a field allied to philosophy in the sense of involving theory, one which was new enough to permit rapid growth so that a young man would not need to wait for his predecessors to die before his work could find recognition, and one which would provide an opportunity to design and work with automatic apparatus. Psychology seemed to satisfy his unique set of requirements. Although Hull set a career in psychology as his goal, he was not financially able to pursue it. Instead, he became the principal of a school he had attended as a child, which had expanded to 2 rooms. In his spare time, he read James's Principles to prepare himself for the chosen profession. After 2 years, he had saved enough money to enter the University of Michigan as a junior. Among the course of that Hull took at Michigan was one of experimental psychology, which he loved, and one of logic, which he constructed a machine that could simulate syllogistic reasoning. After graduation from the University of Michigan, Hull's funds were again exhausted, and he accepted the position in a school of education in Kentucky during this time. Although not yet a graduate in graduate school, he began planning what would become his doctoral dissertation on concept formation. Hull applied for graduate study at Cornell and Yale, where he would ultimately spend most of his professorial career, and was rejected by both. He, however, was accepted to the University of Wisconsin, where he completed his dissertation on concept learning. Although Hull believed that his research represented a breakthrough in experimental psychology, it was essentially ignored. Hildegard, in 1987, reminisced on Hull's experiences. Hull had struggled hard to complete his dissertation, undergoing the trials of a baby daughter, smearing the ink on the charts he had so carefully laid out to dry, so that he had to do them all over again. He felt proud of his dissertation because it moved experimental psychology into an area of thought processes by investigating the learning of concepts. He told me how downcast he had become when, year after year, no one paid attention to it or cited it. He was finally prepared to accept the fact that it had been stillborn. His words. Hull received his doctorate from Wisconsin in 1918 and remained there as an instructor until 1929. Perhaps disappointed over the reception of his dissertation research on concept learning, Hull moved into other research areas. For example, he accepted a research grant to study the influence of pipe smoking on mental and motor performance. Next, Hull was asked to teach a course in psychological tests and measurements. He observed that the existing basis of vocation guidance were not objective, and his effort to improve the situation ultimately resulted in his book Aptitude Testing in 1928. As part of his work in this area, Hull invented a machine that could automatically compute intercorrelations among test scores. This machine, which was programmed by punching holes in a tape, is now housed in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. In addition to his contributions of concept learning and aptitude testing, Hull also studied suggestibility and hypnosis while in Washington. Over about a 10-year period, Hull and his students published 32 papers on the topics. His work culminated in Hull's Hypnosis and Suggestibility, an Experimental Approach in 1933. In 1929, Hull accepted a professorship at Yale University, one of the institutions that rejected his graduate school application. At Yale, Hull pursued 2 interests: the creation of machines that could learn and think, like his correlational machine, and the study of the learning processes. Hull Hull even in 1930 even believed it should be a matter of great difficulty. It should be a matter of no great difficulty to construct parallel inanimate mechanisms, even from inorganic material, which will genuinely manifest the qualities of intelligence, insight, and purpose, and which, insofar, will be truly psychic. A bit ahead of his time then, Hall is today seen as the forerunner of artificial intelligence. Based on his interest in machine learning, juxtaposing machines with learning was entirely compatible for Hall because he viewed humans as machines that learn and think. Not surprisingly, one of Hall's heroes was Newton, who believed that the universe was a huge machine and could be described in precise mathematical terms. Hall simply applied the Newtonian model to living organisms. Another of Hall's heroes was Pavlov. Hall was deeply impressed by the English translation of Pavlov's work that appeared in 1927. He began studying conditioned responses in humans while he was still at Wisconsin and continued his studies when he moved to Yale. At Yale, however, his experimental subjects were rats instead of humans. Hall's many contributions were recognized in 1936 as he served as the 44th president of the APA. In his presidential address, he outlined his goal of creating theoretical psychology that would explain purpose of behavior. Purpose of behavior in terms of mechanistic, lawful principles. In creating this theoretical psychology, Hall would employ the tenets of logical positivism, the Euclidean geometry, in that new knowledge is deducted from what is already known. In his autobiography, he says, "The study of geometry proved to be the most important event in my intellectual life. It opened me to an entirely new world. The fact that thought itself could generate and really prove new relationships from previously possessed elements." Like Watson, Hall believed that psychology's preoccupation with consciousness was derived from medieval metaphysics and theology. Although Hall's interest in psychic machines was now secondary, he did demonstrate such a machine in his APA audience. He expressed the belief that if a machine could be built that performed adaptive behaviors, it would support his contention that the adaptive behaviors of living organisms could be explained in terms of mechanistic principles. Hall was a methodological behaviorist and employed logical positivism in his theorizing. Philosophically, however, Hall was a mechanist and a materialist. Supporters of Hall's mechanistic behaviorism and those of Tolman's purposive behaviorism, considered later in this chapter, battled with each other through the 1930s and 1940s. This running debate resulted in one of the most productive periods in psychology's history. Between 1929 and 1950, Hall wrote 21 theoretical articles in the Psychological Review. And in 1940, he, with co-author Hovland, Ross, Hall, Perkins, and Fitch, believed mathematico-deductive theory of rote learning. This book was an effort to show how rote learning could be explained in terms of conditioning principles. And in 1943, Hall published Principles of Behavior, one of the most influential books in psychology's history. And a behavior system in 1952 extended the ideas found in Principles to more complex phenomena. And in 1948, while preparing the manuscript of A Behavior System, Hall suffered a massive heart attack that exacerbated his already frail physical condition. It took all the strength that he could muster, but he finished the book in 4 months before he died, on May 10, 1952, of another heart attack. Near his death, Hall expressed profound regret that the third book he had been planning would never be written. He believed that his third book would have been his most important because it would extend the system to human social behavior. Hall's hypothetico-deductive theory. Hall and his disciples were the first and perhaps last psychologists to attempt to create a hypothetico-deductive theory of learning. Hall first reviewed the research that had been done on learning, and he summarized that research in the form of general statements or postulates. From these postulates, he inferred theorems that yielded testable propositions. Hall, in 1943, explained why such a system should be self-correcting. Empirical observation, supplemented by shrewd conjecture, is the main source of primary principle or postulates of science. Such formulations, when taken in various combinations together with relevant antecedent conditions, yield inferences or theorems, of which many agree with the empirical outcome of the condition in question, and some may not. Primary propositions yielding logical deductions which consistently agree with the observed empirical outcome are retained, whereas those which disagree are rejected or modified. As the sifting of the trial and error process continues, there gradually emerges a limited series of primary principles whose joint implications are progressively more likely to agree with relevant observations. Deductions made from these surviving postulates, while never absolutely certain, do at length become highly trustworthy. This, in fact, the present status of the primary principles of major physical sciences. Whereas Watson believed that all behavior could be explained in terms of associations between stimuli and response, Hall concluded that the number of intervening internal conditions had to be taken into consideration. For Hall, the intervening events were primarily physiological and linked to innate drives and needs. As such, Hall's theory can be seen as an elaboration of Woodworth's SOR concept. Using operational definitions, Hall attempted to show how a number of internal events interact and cause overt behavior. Hall's theory, then, is also in the Darwinian tradition because it associates reinforcement with those events that are conducive to an organism's survival. In Hall's final statement of this theory in 1952, he listed 17 postulates, 133 theorems, but we review here only a few of the more important concepts. Reinforcement. Unlike Watson and Tolman, Hall was a reinforcement theorist. For Hall, a biological need creates a drive in the organism, and that diminution of this drive constitutes reinforcement. Thus, Hall had a drive reduction theory of enforcement. For Hall, drive is one of the most important events that intervenes between a stimulus and a response. If a response is made in a certain situation leads to drive reduction, habit strength is said to increase. Hall operationally defined habit strength as intervening variable as the number of reinforced pairings between the environmental situation and the response. For Hall, an increase in habit strength constitutes learning. Drive is not the only necessary condition of reinforcement, but also an important energizer of behavior. Hall called the probability of the learned response the reaction potential, which is a function of both the amount of drive present and the number of times the response has been previously reinforced in the situation. Hall expressed this relationship as SER equals SHR times drive. So either SHR or D is 0, the probability of the learned response being made is also 0. Hall postulated several other intervening variables, some of which contributed to SER and some of which diminished it. The probability of learned response is the net effect of all these positive and negative influences, each intervening variable being carefully operationally defined. For more detailed account of Hall's history, see Bowler and Hilgard in 1981. Hall's influence. Within 10 years of the publication of Principles of Behavior in 1943, 40% of all experimental studies in a highly regarded Journal of Experimental Psychology and Journal of Comparative and Physiological Psychology referred to some degree to Hall's theory. The figure increases to 70% when only the fields of learning and motivation are considered. Hall's influence went beyond these areas. However, during the period between 1949 and 1952, there were 105 references to Hall's principles of behavior, and in the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology, compared to the only 25 for the next most commonly cited work. And in 1945, Hall was awarded a prestigious Warren Medal by the Society of Experimental Psychologists. It carried this inscription: "To Clark L. Hall, for his careful development of systematic theory of behavior. This theory stimulated much research, and it has been developed in a precise and quantitative form so as to permit predictions which can be tested empirically. The theory thus contains within itself the seeds of its own ultimate verification of its own possible final disproof. The true, unique achievement in the history of psychology to date." Given his long period of dominance over U.S. psychology, there were many well-known disciples and students of Hall. For example, throughout his text, we have cited one of psychology's most able historians and the 1949 APA president, Ernest Hilgard. Hilgard got his start in the field at Yale. Just as Hall was establishing his program, another APA president, 1963, Charles Osgood, 1916 to 1991, also got his start at Yale before entering his fame as a creator of semantic differential, a way of understanding the linguistic meaning of concepts. O. Herbert Maurer, 1907 to 1982, APA president 1954, survived a sizable scandal following his misbegotten undergraduate research project on sexuality at Missouri, and went on to Johns Hopkins to complete his PhD with Watson, erstwhile colleague Knight Dunlap. From there, Maurer joined Hall's team at Yale. Soon included notables such as Robert Sears, Carl Hovland, and Neil Miller. After Hall's death in 1952, one of his former students, Kenneth W. Spence, 1907 to 1967, became a major spokesperson for his theory. The extensions and modifications Spencer made in Hall's theory were so substantial that the theory became known as the Hall-Spence theory. So successful was Spence in perpetrating Hullian theory that the study showed that as late as the 1960s, Spence was the most cited psychologist in experimental psychology journals, with Hall himself still in 8th place. In recent years, Hall's grand theory was largely given way to the goal of developing hypotheses designed to explain specific phenomena. Neil Miller, APA president 1961, 1909 to 2002, also made important and very different extensions. Miller completed his PhD from Yale in 1935. Working under Hall, after a stint at Vienna Psychoanalytic Institute to study Freud, he returned to Yale, where he remained for many years, frequently writing in collaboration with the psychologist John Dollard. Miller, 1900 to 1980, Miller developed a simplified version of Hall's system, which he applied to personality, psychopathology, and various social phenomena, such as conflict and aggression. His key works included social learning and limitation, and personality and psychotherapy. In 1966, Miller left Yale to focus his attentions on the physiology of behavior, conducting research that would provide a foundation for later work in biofeedback. Although Hall's theory eventually won its battle with Tolman's and was extremely popular in the 1940s and 1950s, under Spence and Miller's influence even into the 60s, it eventually lost to a simpler, more pragmatic behavioral approach offered by Skinner. Hall attempted to create a general behavior theory, and all social sciences could use to explain human action, and his program fit all requirements for logical behaviorism. For example, all his theoretical concepts were operationally defined. However, although Hall's theory was scientifically respectable, it was relatively sterile. More and more, the testable deductions from his theory were criticized for being of little value in explaining behavior beyond the laboratory. Psychologists began to feel hampered by the need to define their concepts operationally and to relate the outcomes of their experiments to an ever more complex grand theory such as Hall's. B.F. Skinner. As the complex theoretical system of Hall began to lose popularity, another form of behavior was in ascendancy, the version promoted by B.F. Skinner. As we will see, Skinner's brand of behaviorism was more in accordance with positivism than with logical positivism. After World War II, Skinner's behaviorism began rivaling all other versions at the time. In time would surpass them. So his name is Boris Frederick Skinner. 1904 to 1990. Was born in Susquehanna, Pennsylvania, into a warm, stable, middle-class family. Skinner had a younger brother who was a better athlete and more socially popular than he was, but who died suddenly at the age of 16. Skinner was raised according to strict moral standards, but was physically punished only once. I was never physically punished by my father, and only once by my mother. She washed my mouth out with soap and water because I had used a bad word. My father never missed an opportunity, however, to inform me of the punishments which were waiting if I turned out to have a criminal mind. He once took me through the county jail, and on summer vacation I was taken to a lecture with colored slides describing life in Sing Sing. As a result, I'm afraid of police and I buy too many tickets to their annual dance. In high school, Skinner did well in literature but poorly in science. He earned money by playing in a jazz band and with an orchestra. He went to Hamilton College, a small liberal arts school in New York, where he majored in English. Skinner did not fit well into college life, was terrible at sports, and felt pushed around by requirements such as daily chapel. By his senior year, Skinner viewed himself in open revolt against school. He, along with his friend, decided to play a trick on their English composition professor, whom they disliked because he was a great name-dropper. Skinner and his friends had posters printed out that read, "Charles Chaplin, the famous cinema comedian, will deliver his lecture, Moving Pictures as a Career, in Hamilton College Chapel on Friday, October 9th. Skinner, 1967. The Chaplin visit was said to be under auspices of the disliked English professor. The posters were displayed all over town, and Skinner's friend called the newspaper in Utica with the news. By noon, the prank was completely out of hand. Police roadblocks were necessary to control the crowds. The next day, the English professor to whom the hoax was directed wrote an editorial lambasting the entire episode. Skinner said that it was the best thing the professor had ever wrote. The Chaplin prank was only the beginning of the mischievous senior year for Skinner. As a nihilistic gesture, the hoax was only the beginning. Through the student publications, we began to attack the faculty and various local sacred cows. I published a prodigy of the bumbling manner in which a professor of public speaking would review student performances by the end of class. I wrote the editorial attacking Phi Beta Kappa. At commencement, I covered the walls with bitter caricatures of the faculty, and we, Skinner and his friends, made a shambles of the commencement ceremonies, and at intermission, the president warned us sternly that we would not get our degrees if we did not settle down. Skinner graduated from Hamilton College with a bachelor's degree in English literature and a Phi Beta Kappa key without having had a course in psychology. He left college with a passion to become a writer. The passion was encouraged in part by the fact that the famous poet Robert Frost favorably reviewed 3 of his short stories. Skinner's first attempt at writing was in the attic of his parents' home. The results were disastrous. I frittered away my time. I read aimlessly. I listened to the newly invented radio, contributed to the humorous column of the local paper, but wrote almost nothing else. I thought about seeing a psychiatrist. Next, Skinner tried writing in New York City's Greenwich Village, and then in Paris for a summer. These attempts also failed. By this time, Skinner, in 1967, had developed a distaste for the most literary pursuits. I had failed as a writer because I had had nothing important to say, but I could not accept that explanation. It was literature which must be at fault. Having failed to describe human behavior through literature, Skinner decided to describe it scientifically. While in Greenwich Village, Skinner had read the works of Pavlov and Watson and was greatly impressed. On his return from Europe in 1928, he enrolled in a graduate program in psychology at Harvard. Feeling that he at last found his niche, Skinner threw himself completely into his studies. I would rise at 6, study until breakfast, go to classes, laboratories, and libraries with no more than 15 minutes unscheduled during the day, study until exactly 9 o'clock at night, and go to bed. I saw no movies or plays, seldom went to concerts, and I scarcely any dates, and read nothing but psychology and physiology. This high degree of self-discipline typified Skinner's work habits throughout his long life. Skinner earned his master's degree in 2 years in 1930 and his doctorate the next in 1931, and then remained at Harvard for 5 more years as a postdoctoral fellow. Skinner began his teaching career at the University of Minnesota in 1937 and remained there until 1945. While he was at Minnesota, Skinner published The Behavior of Organisms, which established him as a nationally prominent experimental psychologist. And in 1945, Skinner moved to Indiana University as the chairman of the psychology department, where he remained until 1948, when he returned to Harvard. At Indiana, Skinner overlapped with others that would flourish during the heyday of American behaviorism, including the aforementioned William Estes, Jacob Robert Cantor, 1888 to 1984, and Winthrop Kellogg, an animal psychologist who raised a chimp alongside his son. William Verplanek, co-founder of the needed to get my glasses. Now, once again, with vision. William Verplanek, co-founder of the prestigious Psychonomic Society. Like Watson, Cantor developed his interbehaviorism out of the graduate studies at Chicago. Interbehaviorism sought to align psychology with the objective methods of the natural sciences, but focused more on social behavior and language. Variations on Cantor's approach are still used in modern behavioral therapy, and were associated with the ecological approach to other psychologists such as J.J. Gibson and Robert Barker. It was during his time at Indiana that Skinner built his infamous Baby Tender and wrote his utopian novel Walden 2. Following the birth of his second daughter, Deborah, Skinner made a crib-sized living space with sound-absorbing walls and a large picture window. Air entered through the filters at the bottom and around the edges tightly stretched canvas, which served as a mattress. A strip of a sheeting 10 yards long passed over the canvas, a clean section of which would be cranked into place. Although he initially failed to get General Mills to mass-produce the invention, he did publish an article about it in Ladies' Home Journal, and years later they were manufactured and sold by Aircrib Corporation. As for the novel, it describes the benefits of a society based on behavioral principles, as advocated by its founder, Fraser. Over his lifetime, sales were good, with almost 2,500,000 copies sold in 1990. After Indiana, Skinner remained affiliated with Harvard until his death in 1990, and in 1974 he became Professor Emeritus, but continued for years to walk the 2 miles between his home and his office in William James Hall to answer correspondence, to meet with scholars who paid him visits around the world, and on occasion to conduct research and supervise graduate students. In addition to the short autobiography Skinner wrote in 1967, he described the details of his life in 3 more extensive volumes: Particulars of My Life in 1976, The Shaping of a Behaviorist in 1979, and A Matter of Consequences in 1983. Skinner's positivism. In Chapter 4, we discuss the great Renaissance thinker Francis Bacon. Bacon was intensely interested in overcoming the mistakes of the past and thus arriving at knowledge that was free of superstition and prejudice. His solution to the problem was to stay very close to what was empirically observable and avoid theorizing about it. Bacon proposed that science can be descriptive and inductive rather than theoretical and deductive. Following Bacon's suggestion, scientists would first gather empirical facts and then infer knowledge about those facts, instead of first developing abstract theories from which facts are deduced. Bacon's main point was that in the formulation of theories, a scientist's biases, misconceptions, traditions, and beliefs, perhaps false beliefs, could manifest themselves in these things, and these very things inhibited the search for objective knowledge. Skinner was deeply impressed by Bacon and often referred to him as an influence on his life and work. Bacon can be seen as a forerunner to positivistic traditions of Comte and then Mach. As he did with Bacon, Skinner often acknowledged a debt to Mach. For Mach, as we have previously noted, it was important that science rid itself of metaphysical concepts, which for him were any concepts that refer to events that cannot be directly observed, such as causation. Mach and other positivists were interested only in facts and how facts are related to each other. According to Mach, the scientist determines how facts are related by doing a functional analysis. That is, by noting that if X occurs, Y also tends to occur. To ponder why such relationships exist is to enter a dangerous and unnecessary realm of metaphysics. The job of science is to describe empirical relationships, not explain them. Skinner followed Mach's positivism explicitly. By adopting Mach's functional approach to science, Skinner, in 1931, avoided the complex problem of establishing causation in human behavior. We may now take a more humble view of explanation and causation, which seems to have been the first suggested by Mach, and is now a common characteristic of scientific thought, wherein the notion of functionalism, a function, is substituted for that of causation. As so far as theory is concerned, Skinner was a positivist, not a logical positivist. Functional analysis of behavior. Like Watson, Skinner denied the existence of a separate realm of conscious events. He believed that what we call mental events are simply verbal labels given to certain bodily processes. My position can be stated as follows. What is felt or introspectively observed is not some non-physical world of consciousness, mind, or mental event, but the observer's own body. But, said Skinner, even if there were mental events, nothing would be gained by studying them. He reasoned that if environmental events gave rise to conscious events, which in turn cause behavior, nothing is lost, and a great deal is gained by simply doing the functional analysis of environmental and the behavioral events. Such an analysis avoids the many problems associated with the study of mental events. These so-called mental events, said Skinner, will someday be explained when we learn which internal physiological events people are responding to, and when they use such terms as thinking, choosing, and willing to explain their own behavior. Skinner then was a physical monist, a materialist, because he believed that consciousness as a non-physical entity does not exist. Because we do not at present know to which internal events people are responding when they use mentalistic terminology. We must be content simply to ignore such terms. Skinner in 1974 said, "There is nothing in science of behavior or its philosophy which need alter feelings and introspective observations. The bodily states which are felt or observed are acknowledged, and there is an emphasis on the environmental conditions with which they are associated, and an instance that it is the conditions rather than the feelings which enable us to explain behavior." Skinner in 1974 also said, "A completely independent science of subjective experience would have no more bearing on science of behavior than a science of what people feel about fire would have on the science of combustion. And there's no place in the scientific position for a self as a true originator or initiator of action." Like Watson then, Skinner was a radical behaviorist in the fact that he refused to acknowledge any causal mental events in human conduct. For Skinner, so-called mental events were nothing but neurophysiological events to which we have assigned mentalistic labels. Skinner continued to attack cognitive psychology throughout his professional life, and towards the end of his life. He deeply regretted the increased popularity of cognitive psychology. Operant behavior. Whereas Watson modeled his psychology after Russian physiologists, Skinner modeled his after Thorndike, Watson, and Pavlov attempted to correlate behavior with environmental stimuli. That is, they were interested in reflexive behavior. Skinner called such behavior as respondent behavior because it elicited by a known stimulus. Given that both Pavlov and Watson studied the relationship between environmental stimuli and responses, their endeavors represent the SR psychology. Thorndike, however, studied behavior that is controlled by its consequences. For example, behavior that had been instrumental in allowing an animal to escape from the puzzle box tends to be repeated when the animal is placed in the puzzle box. Using Thorndike's experimental arrangement, a response was instrumental in producing certain consequences, and therefore the type of learning that he studied was called instrumental conditioning. Thorndike neither knew nor cared about the origins of behavior, only that it was controlled by its consequences. What Thorndike called instrumental behavior, Skinner called operant behavior, because it operates on the environment in such a way as to produce consequences. Unlike respondent behavior, which elicited by a known stimulation, operant behavior was simply emitted by an organism. It is not that operant behavior is not caused, but it is that it causes are not important. The important aspect of operant behavior is that it is controlled by its consequences. Skinner's focus on operant behavior made his brand of behaviorism very different from Watson's. Although both Skinner and Thorndike studied behavior controlled by its consequences, how they studied behavior differed. Thorndike measured how long it took for an animal to make an escape response as a function of successive reinforced trials. He found that the number of reinforced escapes increases the time it takes for the animal to escape decreases. His dependent variable was the latency of escape. His dependent variable was the latency of escape response. Skinner's procedure was to allow an animal to respond freely in an experimental chamber called Skinner's box, and to note the effect of reinforcement on the response rate. For example, a lever press response may occur in only 2 or 3 times a minute before it is reinforced, and 30 or 40 times a minute when it results in reinforcement. The rate of responding, then, was Skinner's primary dependent variable. Based on his work, several schedules of reinforcement were identified. These include variable interval schedules, such as a teacher that calls on students in class. Not knowing when they might be called on, the variable interval, students need to remain on task in order to be reinforced. In contrast, there are also fixed interval schedules, such as how students behave at the end of class as the end of class period nears. Have you ever noticed that in class that always runs until the end of the period that students close their books and start to fidget in advance of being dismissed? After a period of no opportunity for reinforcement, a flurry of behavior comes just before at the fixed interval. Besides time intervals, schedules can be understood as ratios on behavior to reinforcement. For example, when you use vending machine, you know how many quarters to use before you get your food. That is, the ratio between behavior, putting in a quarter, and getting your reward is fixed. So it is unlikely that you would under or over respond. And last, there are variable ratios, such as slot machines. In this case, you do not know how many quarters you will need to put in before a payout, and as such behavior will be repeated often. Despite the difference between them, however, both Watson and Skinner exemplified radical behaviorism because they believed that behavior could be completely explained in terms of events external to the organism. For Watson, environmental events elicited either learned or unlearned responses. For Skinner, the environment selects behavior via reinforcement contingencies. For both, what goes on within the organism is relatively unimportant. In contrast, Hull exemplified methodological behaviorism because he postulated a wealth of events that were supposed to intervene between the experience and behavior. The nature of reinforcement. If an operant response leads to reinforcement, the rate of that response increases. Thus, those responses an organism makes that result in reinforcement are more likely to reoccur when an organism is next in the situation. This is what is meant by the statement that operant behavior is controlled by its consequences. According to Skinner, reinforcement can be identified only through its effects on behavior. Just because something acts as a reinforcer for one organism under one set of circumstances does not mean that it will be a reinforcer for another organism or for the same organism under different circumstances. In dealing with our fellow men in everyday life and in the clinic and laboratory, we may need to know just how reinforcing a specific event is. We often begin by noting the extent to which our own behavior is reinforced by the same event. This practice frequently miscarries, yet it is still commonly believed that reinforcers can be identified apart from their effects upon a particular organism. As the term is used here, however, the only defining characteristic of a reinforcing stimulus is that it reinforces. Thus, for Skinner, there is no talk of drive reduction, satisfy states of affairs, or any other mechanism of reinforcement. The reinforcer is anything that, when made contingent on a response, changes the rate of the response which is made. For Skinner, nothing additional needs to be said. He accepted Thorndike's law of effect, but not the mentalism that the phrase satisfying state of affairs implies. The importance of the environment. Whereas the environment was important for Watson and the Russian physiologists because it elicited behavior, it was important for Skinner because it selected behavior. The reinforcement contingencies the environment provides determine which behaviors are strengthened and which are not. Change reinforcement contingencies and you change behavior. The environment is obviously important, but its role has remained obscure. It does not push or pull, it selects, and this function is difficult to discover and analyze. The role of natural selection in evolution was formulated only a little more than 100 years ago, and the selective role of environment in shaping and maintaining the behavior of the individual is only beginning to be recognized and studied. As the interaction between organism and environment has come to be understood, however, effects once assigned to states of mind, feeling, and traits are beginning to be traced to accessible conditions. The technology of behavior may therefore become available. It will not solve our problems, however, until it replaces traditional pre-scientific views, and these views are strongly entrenched. Thus, Skinner applies Darwinian notions to the analysis of behavior. If any given situation, an organism initially makes a wide variety of responses. Of those responses, only a few will be functional or reinforcing. These effective responses survive and become part of an organism's response repertoire to be used when the situation occurs next. According to Skinner, the fact that behavior is governed by reinforcement contingencies provides hope for a solution to a number of societal problems. If it was the mind or the self that needed to be understood instead of how the environment selects behavior, we would be in trouble. Fortunately, the point of attack is more readily accessible. It is the environment which must be changed. A way of life which furthers the study of human behavior in relation to the environment should be the best possible position to solve its major problems. It is not jingoism, which the great problems are now global. In the behavioristic view, man can now control his own destiny because he knows what must be done and how to do it. Skinner's novel, Walden 2, also made many of these points. Following Watson's commercialization of psychology to the public, there had been something of a backlash against the notion of better life through the science of psychology. For example, Orwell's 1984 and Huxley's Brave New World both featured conditioning gone amok. As such, many of Skinner's work sought to showcase how psychology could positively serve society. In Beyond Freedom and Dignity in 1971, Skinner reviewed the reasons that cultural engineering, although possible, has been largely rejected. The control of behavior. Like Thorndike, Skinner in 1971 found that the effects of reinforcement and punishment are not symmetrical. Reinforcement strengthens behavior, but punishment does not weaken behavior. A child who has been severely punished for sex play is not necessarily less inclined to continue, and a man who has been in prison for violent assault is not necessarily inclined towards violence. Punishment behavior is likely to reappear after the punitive contingencies are withdrawn. Why, if punishment is ineffective as a modifier of behavior, is it so widely used? Because, said Skinner, it is reinforcing to the punisher. Severe punishment unquestionably has an immediate effect in reducing a tendency to act in a given way. This result is no doubt responsible for its widespread use. We instinctively attack anyone whose behavior displeases us, perhaps not in physical assault, but with criticism, disapproval, blame, or ridicule. Whether or not there is any inherent tendency to do this, the immediate effect of the practice is reinforcing enough to explain its currency. In the long run, however, punishment does not actually eliminate behavior from the repertoire, and its temporary achievement is obtained at tremendous cost in reducing the overall efficiency and happiness of the group. The tremendous cost involved in the use of punishment comes from many negative byproducts associated with it, including the fact that it induces fear, often elicits aggression, it justifies inflicting pain on others, and it often replaces one undesirable response with another. such as when a child is spanked for the wrongdoing, cries instead. How then is undesirable behavior to be dealt with? Skinner in 1951 said to ignore it. The most effective alternative process to punishment is probably extinction. This takes time, but is much more rapid than allowing the response to be forgotten. The technique seems to be relatively free of objectable byproducts. We recommend it. For example, when we suggest that a parent pay no attention to objectable behavior on the part of the child, if the child's behavior is strong only because it has been reinforced by getting a rise out of the parent, it will disappear when the consequence is no longer forthcoming. Because of the relative ineffectiveness of punishment and many negative byproducts associated with its use, Skinner consistently urged that behavior be modified positively through reinforcement contingencies and not negatively through punishment. Students are sometimes confused then by the notion of and term negative reinforcement. Importantly, negative reinforcement is not punishment. Negative reinforcement is reinforcement by removal of an unpleasant environmental circumstance instead of providing a rewarding circumstance as a positive reinforcement. But in both situations, the result is reinforcing. Skinnerian principles. Skinner's attitude towards theory. Skinner accepted operationism, but rejected the theoretical aspects of logical positivism. He was content to manipulate environmental events such as reinforcement contingencies and note the effects of these manipulations on behavior, believing that the functional analysis is all that is necessary for this reason. Skinner's approach is sometimes referred to as descriptive behaviorism. There is, Skinner felt, no reason for looking under the skin for explanations of relationships between the environment and behavior. Looking for physiological explanations of behavior is a waste of time because overt behavior occurs whether or not we know its neurophysiological underpinnings. We've already reviewed Skinner's attitude towards mentalistic explanation of behavior because Skinner did not care what was going on under the skin, either physiologically or mentally. By his approach is even referred to as the empty organism approach. Skinner knew, of course, that the organism is not empty and thought that nothing is lost by ignoring events that intervene between the environment and the behavior it selects. Besides opposing physiological and mentalistic explanations of behavior, Skinner in 1950 opposed abstract theorizing. Research designed with respect to theory is also likely to be wasteful. That a theory generates research does not prove its value unless the research is valuable. Much useless experimentation results from theories, and much energy and skill are absorbed by them. Most theories are eventually overthrown, and a great part of the associated research is discarded. This could be justified if it were true that productive research requires a theory, as is, of course, often claimed. It is argued that research would be aimless and disorganized without the theory to guide it. The view is supported by psychological texts which take their cue from the logicians rather than empirical science, and describe thinking as necessarily involving stages of hypothesis, deduction, experimental test, and confirmation. But this is not the way most scientists actually work. It is possible to design significant experiments for other reasons, and possibly to be examined is such research and will lead more directly to the kind of information which a science usually accumulates. In describing his non-theoretical approach, Skinner in 1956 said that he tried something, and if it seemed to be leading to something useful, he persisted. If what he was doing seemed to be leading to a dead end, he abandoned it and tried something else. Applications. Like Watson, Skinner and his followers sought to apply these principles to the solutions of practical problems. In all applications of Skinnerian principles, one general rule was always the same. Change reinforcement contingencies and you will change behavior. This principle has been used to teach pigeons to play games like table tennis and basketball, and many animals trained through the use of Skinnerian principles have performed as tourist attractions throughout the United States. In a defense effort, Skinner and colleagues, Estes as well as Marion and Keller Breland, even trained pigeons to guide missiles towards enemy targets. In the realm of education, Skinner developed a teaching technique called programmed learning in 1954 and 1958, With programmed learning, material is presented to students in small steps. Students are then tested on the material and given immediate feedback on the accuracy of their answers, and allowed to proceed through the material at their own pace. Skinner had criticized U.S. education ever since 1953 when he visited his daughter's classroom and concluded that the teacher was violating everything that was known about learning. Skinner in 1984 maintained that many of the problems with our educational system could be solved through use of operant principles. Skinner's main criticism of the U.S. educational practices was the threat of punishment is used to force students to learn and to behave instead of carefully manipulating the reinforcement contingencies. This aversive control, Skinner said, creates a negative attitude towards education. In 1983, Skinner, along with Margaret Vagan, wrote Enjoy Old Age, Living Fully Your Later Years, in which they address such topics as diet, retirement, exercise, forgetfulness, sensory deficiencies, and the fear of death. Interestingly, although Skinner counseled the elderly to avoid fatigue, he and Vagan wrote a book in 3 months. Skinner and his followers have applied behavioral modification principles to helping individuals with problems ranging from psychosis to smoking, alcoholism, drug addiction, mental retardation, juvenile delinquency, speech disorders, shyness, phobias, obesity, and sexual dysfunction. The Skinnerian version of behavior therapy assumes that people learn abnormal behavior in the same way that they learn normal behavior. Therefore, treatment is a matter of removing the enforcers that are maintaining the undesirable behavior and arranging the reinforcement contingencies so that they strengthen desirable behavior. Skinnerian principles have also been used in the creation of token economies in a number of institutions and psychiatric hospitals. When participants in such economies behave in desirable ways, they are reinforced with tokens that they can exchange for candy, cigarettes, coffee, or exclusive use of radio and television set. Token economies have been criticized and contrived or unnatural, but according to Masters, Burish, Holland, and Rim in 1987, it is institutions without token economies that are unnatural and relatively ineffective. Token economies are not really unnatural. Indeed, any national economy with currency system, in its every sense, a token economy. Any currency consists of definition of token or symbolic reinforcers that may be exchanged for items that constitute a more direct form of reinforcement, whereas an individual in society works to earn tokens, or money, with which he purchases his dwelling, food, recreation, and so on. Most institutions provide such comforts non-contingently and hence cease to encourage many adaptive behaviors that are appropriate and effective in the natural environment. In general, the use of Skinnerian principles in treating behavior problems has been very effective. And listing lots of different research peoples for his role in developing behavior modification procedures used to improve the quality of life with the mentally retarded. Skinner was presented the Kennedy International Award in 1971. In 1972, he was named Humanist of the Year by the American Humanist Association. And on August 10, 1990, the APA presented Skinner with an unprecedented Lifetime Contribution to Psychology Award. 8 days later, he died of leukemia at the age of 86. As further tribute to Skinner, the entire November 1992 issue of American Psychologist was dedicated to his ideas and their influence. Edward Chas Tolman, 1886 to 1959. Was born in West Newton, Massachusetts, the son of a businessman who was a member of the first graduating class of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and later a member of the Board of Trustees. Tolman's father, encouraged by his wife, who was raised in the Quaker religion, had a strong interest in social reform. Both sons, Edward and his older brother Richard, earned their undergraduate degrees in chemistry at MIT. Nice. Hold on. Richard went on to become a prominent physicist after earning his doctorate at MIT. Edward's interests began to turn towards philosophy and psychology after taking summer school courses from Harvard philosopher Ralph Barton Perry in 1876 to 1957. and Harvard psychologist Robert Yerkes. Most influential, however, was reading James's Principles. At this time, U.S. psychology was dominated by Titchener and James. The psychology is still defined as the study of the conscious experience. That fact bothered Tolman in 1922. The definition of psychology as an examination and analysis of private conscious content has been something of a logical sticker. And for how can one build up a science upon elements which, by very definition, are said to be private and non-communicable? Tolman's concern was put to rest in the course he took from Yerkes, in which J.B. Watson, Behavior and Introduction to Comparative Psychology, was used as the text. This worry about introspection is perhaps one of the reasons my introduction to Yerkes' courses to Watson's behaviorism became a tremendous stimulus and relief. If objective measurement of behavior and not introspection were the true method of psychology, I didn't have to worry any longer. In 1911, Tolman decided to pursue graduate work in philosophy and psychology at Harvard. Once enrolled, his interest turned increasingly to psychology. After a year of study, Tolman decided to improve his German by spending a summer in Germany. While in Germany, Tolman studied with the young Gestalt psychologist Kurt Kafka, whom we will meet in the next chapter. And Gestalt psychology greatly influenced his later theorizing. Upon returning to Harvard, Tolman studied the learning of nonsense material under the supervision of Munsterberg, and his doctoral dissertation on radioactive inhibition. After attaining his doctorate at Harvard in 1915, Tolman accepted the appointment at Northwestern University. Although he became a compulsive researcher, he confessed to being self-conscious and inarticulate as a teacher and frightened of his class. Also, about the time that the United States entered World War I, he wrote an essay expressing his pacifism, and in 1918, Tolman was dismissed for lack of teaching success. But more than likely, his pacifism contributed to his dismissal. From Northwestern, he went to the University of California at Berkeley, where he remained almost without interruption for the rest of his career. As we have seen, Tolman was raised in a Quaker home, and pacifism was a constant theme throughout his life. He wrote a short book titled Drives Toward War in 1942 to explain the psychoanalytic viewpoint, the human motives responsible for warfare. In the preface of his book, he stated his reason for writing it. As an American, a college professor, and one brought up in a pacifist tradition, I am intensely biased against war. It is for me stupid, interrupting, unnecessary, and unimaginably horrible. I write this essay within that frame of reference. In short, I am driven to discuss the psychology of war and its possible abolition because I want intensely to get rid of it. By the time the book came out, however, the United States was already involved in World War II. The brutality of the war overcame even Tolman's strong pacifism, and after receiving the approval of his brother Richard, he served 2 years in the Office of Strategic Services, 1944 to 1945. After the war, Tolman's social conscience was tested once again. In the early 1950s, under the influence of McCarthyism, the University of California began to require its faculty members to sign a loyalty oath, and Tolman led a group of faculty members that would rather resign than sign it. Rather resign than sign it. We saw the requirement as an infringement of the civil liberties and academic freedom. Tolman was suspended from his duties at California and taught for a while at the University of Chicago and Harvard. Finally, the courts agreed with Tolman, and he was reinstated at the University of California. In 1959, upon his retirement and shortly before his death, the regents of the university symbolically admitted that Tolman's position had been morally correct and awarded him with an honorary doctorate. Tolman was a kind, shy, honest person who aspired affection and admiration from his students and colleagues. Although he was always willing to engage in an intellectual dispute, he never took himself or his work too seriously. In the final year of his life, Tolman in 1959 reflected on his theoretical contributions. My theory may not stand up to any final canons of scientific procedure, but I do not much care. I have liked to think about psychology in ways that have proved congenital to me. Since all the sciences, and especially psychology, are still immersed in such tremendous realms of the uncertain and the unknown, the best that any individual scientist, especially any psychologist, can do seems to follow his own gleam and his own bent. However inadequate they may be, in fact, I suppose that actually this is what we all do. In the end, the only sure criterion is to have fun. And I have had fun. Tolman died in Berkeley, California on November 19th, 1959. Purposive behaviorism. In the early 1920s, there were two dominant explanations of learning. Watson's explanation in terms of such Watson's explanation in terms of such associative principles of contiguity and frequency, and Thorndike's, which emphasized the law of effect. Tolman explained why he could accept neither. It was Watson's denial of the law of effect and his emphasis on frequency and recency as the prime determiners of animal learning which first attracted our attention. In this, we were on Watson's side, but we got ourselves, or at least I got myself, into a sort of in-between position. On the one hand, I sided with Watson in not liking the law of effect, but on the other hand, I also did not like Watson's oversimplified notions of stimulus and response. Tolman, perhaps incorrectly, referred to Watson's psychology as twitchism, because he felt it concentrated on the responses to specific stimuli. Watson contended that even the most complex human behavior could be explained in terms of SR reflexes. Tolman referred to such reflexes as molecular behavior. Instead of taking as his subject matter these twitches, Tolman decided to study purposive behavior. Although Tolman's approach differed from Watson's in several important ways, Tolman was still a behaviorist and was completely opposed to introspection. In other words, Tolman agreed with Watson that behavior should be psychology's subject matter, but Tolman believed that Watson was focusing on the wrong type of behavior. The question was how Tolman could employ a mentalistic term like purpose and still remain a behaviorist. While at Harvard, Tolman learned from two of his professors, Edwin B. Holt and Ralph Barton Perry, that purposive aspects of behavior could be studied without sacrificing scientific objectivity. This is done by seeing purpose in the behavior itself and not inferring purpose from the behavior. Tolman accepted this contention and believed that it pointed to a major distinction between his view and the purpose of that of McDougall. The fundamental difference between McDougall and us arises in that he, being a mentalist, merely infers purpose from the aspects of behavior, whereas we, as behaviorists, identify purpose with such aspects. Tolman would later change his position and use the terms purpose and cognition more in accordance with the mentalistic tradition as actual determinants of behavior. Tolman never believed, however, that using concepts like purpose and cognition violated the tenets of behaviorism. For a discussion on Tolman's use of mentalistic terms and how that use changed during his career, see L.D. Smith, 1982. Tolman called purposive behavior molar behavior in contrast to molecular behavior. Because Tolman chose to study molar behavior, his position is often referred to as purposive behaviorism. In his major work, Purposive Behavior in Animals and Men, 1932, Tolman gave examples of what he calls purposive or molar behavior. A rat running a maze, a cat getting out of the puzzle box, a man driving home from dinner, a child hiding from a stranger, a woman doing her washing or gossiping over the telephone, a pupil making a mental test sheet, a psychologist reciting a list of nonsense syllables, my friend and I telling one another our thoughts and feelings. These are behaviors. Qua molar. It must be noted that in mentioning no one of them have we referred to, or we blush to confess it, for the most part, even known what were the exact muscles and glands, sensory nerves, and motor neurons involved. For these responses somehow had other sufficiently identifying properties of their own. Tolman's rats. Tolman did not engage in any animal research. As a graduate student at Harvard or as an instructor at Northwestern University, when he arrived at the University of California, he was asked to suggest a new course to teach. And remembering his time with Yerkes, he chose to teach comparative psychology. It was teaching this course that stimulated Tolman's interest in the rat as an experimental subject. He saw the use of rats as a way of guarding against even the possibility of indirect introspection that could occur in humans. When humans were used as experimental subjects. Tolman developed such a fondness for rats that he dedicated his purpose of behavior to the white rat. And in 1945, he said, "Let it be noted that rats live in cages. They do not go on binges the night before one has planned an experiment. They do not kill each other off in wars. They do not invent engines of destruction. And if they did, they would not be so inept about controlling such engines. They do not go in for either class conflicts or race conflicts. They avoid politics, economics, and papers on psychology. They are marvelous, pure, and delightful." About what could be learned by studying rats, Tolman said, "I believe that everything important in psychology, except perhaps matters as the building up of a superego, that is, everything save much matters as involves society in words, can be investigated in essence through the continued experimental and theoretical analysis of the determiners of rats' behavior at a choice point in a maze. Herein, I agree with Professor Hull and also with Professor Thorndike. The use of intervening variables. Tolman was not consistent in his using of mentalistic concepts as only descriptions of behavior. By 1925, he referred to the purpose and cognition both as descriptions and determinants of behavior. The following quotation, Tolman, 1928, appeared to believe that purposes were in the organism and were causally related to its behavior. Our doctrine is that behavior, except in the case of the simplest reflexes, is not governed by simple one-to-one stimulus-response connections. It is governed by more or less complicated set of patterns of adjustment which get set up within the organism. And insofar as these sets of adjustments can only those acts to persist and to get learned which end is getting the organism to or from specific ends. These sets or adjustments constitutes purpose. Increasingly, Tolman came to believe that cognitive processes really exist and are influential in determining behavior. As McDougall believed in 1938, he decided how he would proceed. I, in my future work, intend to go ahead imagining how, if I were a rat, I would behave. Clearly, Tolman was now embracing mentalism. And yet he still felt strongly about remaining a behaviorist. For Tolman, the solution to the dilemma was to treat cognitive events as intervening variables, that is, variables that intervene between environmental events and behavior. Following logical positivism, Tolman painstakingly tied all of his interviewing variables to observable behavior. In other words, he operationally defined all of his theoretical terms. Tolman's final position was to regard purpose and cognition as theoretical constructs that could be used to describe, predict, and explain behavior. By introducing the use of intervening variables, Tolman brought abstract scientific theory into psychology. It was clear that environmental events influenced behavior. The problem was to understand why they did. One could remain entirely descriptive and simply know that organisms do in certain situations, but for Tolman, this was unsatisfactory. Here is a simplified diagram of Tolman's approach. Independent variable, environmental events. Intervening variable, theoretical concepts. Dependent variable, behavior. Ding, ding, ding. Thus, for Tolman, environmental experience gives rise to internal unobservable events, which in turn cause behavior. To account fully for the behavior, one has to know both environmental events and the internal or intervening events that they initiate. The most important intervening variables Tolman postulated are cognitive. Tolman was then a methodological rather than a radical behaviorist. What made Tolman a different type of mentalist was his insistence that his intervening variables, even those that were presumed to be mental, were operationally defined, that is, systematically tied to observable events. Hypotheses, expectancies, beliefs, and cognitive maps. Starting to get weird. Although Tolman used several intervening variables, we will discuss only those related to the development of a cognitive map. Everyone knows the rat learns to solve a maze. The question is, how does it do it? Tolman's explanation was mentalistic. As an example, when the animal was first placed in the start box of a T maze, the experience is entirely new, and therefore the animal can use no information from prior experience. As the animal runs the maze, it sometimes turns left at a chance point, sometimes turns right at a chance point, sometimes left. Let us say that the experimenter has arranged the situation so that turning left is reinforced with food. At some point, the animal formulates a hypothesis that turning one way leads to food and turning the other way does not. In early stages of hypothesis formation, the animal may pause at the choice point as if to ponder the alternatives. Tolman referred to this apparent pondering as vicarious trial and error, because instead of behaving overtly in a trial and error fashion, the animal appears to be engaged in a mental trial and error. If the early hypothesis, if I turn left I will find food, is confirmed, the animal will develop the expectancy. And when I turn left I will find food, if the expectancy is consistently confirmed, the animal will develop the belief. Every time I turn left in this situation, I will find food. Through this process, a cognitive map of the situation develops, an awareness of all possibilities in the situation. For example, if I leave the start box, I will find the choice point, and if I turn left at the choice point, I will find food. If I turn right, I will not, and so on. So for Tolman, hypotheses, expectancies, beliefs, and finally a cognitive map intervene between behavior and experience. Rather than just describing an organism's behavior, these intervening variables were thought to explain it. Tolman was careful, however, to test the theoretical assumptions through experimentation. Tolman's research program was one of the most creative any psychologist has ever devised. Tolman on reinforcement. Tolman did not believe that learning is an automatic process based on contiguity and frequency, nor that it results from reinforcement, a pleasurable state of affairs. He believed that learning occurs constantly, with or without reinforcement, and with or without motivation. About as close as Tolman came to a concept of reinforcement was confirmation. Through confirmation of a hypothesis, expectancy, or belief, a cognitive map develops or is maintained. The animal learns what leads to what in the environment, that if it does such and such and such and such will follow, or that if it sees one stimulus, a second stimulus will follow. Because Tolman emphasized the learning relationships among stimuli, his position is sometimes called the SS theory, rather than the SR theory. According to Tolman's theory, an organism learns constantly as it observes its environment. But whether the organism uses what's learned, and if so, how, is determined by the organism's motivational state. For example, food-satiated rat might not leave the start box of the maze, or might wander causally through the maze, even though it had previously learned what had to be done to obtain food. Thus, for Tolman, motivation influences performance, but not learning. Tolman defined performance as the translation of learning into behavior. The importance of motivation in Tolman's theory was due to the influence of Woodworth's dynamic psychology. Latent learning. In one of his famous latent learning experiments, Tolman dramatically demonstrated the distinction between learning and performance. Tolman and Honzik, 1930, ran the experiment using 3 groups of rats as subjects. Subjects in Group 1 were reinforced with food each time they correctly traversed the maze. Subjects in Group 2 wandered through the maze but were not reinforced if they reached the goal box. Subjects in Group 3 were treated like subjects in Group 2 until the 11th day, when they began receiving reinforcement in the goal box. Subjects in all 3 groups were deprived of food before being placed in the maze. Tolman's hypothesis was that subjects in all groups were learning the maze, making cognitive maps as they wandered through. If this hypothesis was correct, subjects in Group 3 should perform as well as subjects in Group 1 from the 12th day on. This was because before the 11th day, subjects in group 3 had already learned and mapped out how to arrive at the goal box, and finding food there on the 11th day had given them an incentive for acting on this information. As figure 13.1 shows, the experiment supported Tolman's hypothesis. Learning appeared to remain latent until the organism had a reason to use it. Although much of this work was done before Hull and Skinner had reached their zenith, we place Tolman after them because his findings contrast so sharply the position of such reinforcement theorists. Skinner's system, which remains popular today, and Hull's system, which has enjoyed some resurgence as a model for developing intelligent machines, are both systems in which learning is tied to doing. The learning is frequently the consequence of behavior. It is not in dispute, but Tolman's more cognitively oriented results show the complexity of learning as well as the viability of other explanations. Tolman's influence. L.D. Smith in 1982 summarizes Tolman's importance as follows. In adopting and adapting the concepts of purpose and cognition, Tolman helped preserve and shape the tradition of cognitive psychology during a time when it was nearly eclipsed by the ascendancy of classical behaviorism. He was able to do so by demonstrating that such concepts were compatible with behaviorism of a more sophisticated variety. With regard to Tolman's mentalistic concepts, Innes says, rather than get rid of them, he wanted to give them objective operational definitions. In place of the sterile mathematics and empty organisms of his competitors, Tolman proposed a rich theoretical structure in which purpose and cognition played well-defined parts as potentially measurable intervening variables. For him, action were infused with meaning. Behavior was goal-directive, that is, it was motivated and purposive. However, adopting this view did not mean that it was impossible to develop mechanistic rules to account for the behavior observed. Like Hall, once Tolman began postulating intervening variables, his theory became extremely complex. He postulated several independent variables and several intervening variables. The possible interactions between the two variables were enormous. Tolman expressed regret over this practical difficulty, and L.D. Smith in 1982 notes modern computing has offered some hope for managing this complexity and is invited a reconsideration for such theories. Invited. I don't know why I'm struggling with that word. Clearly, Tolman reviewed organisms as active processors of information, and such a view is very much in accordance with contemporary cognitive psychology. In Chapter 19, we're going to see how much in common Tolman's theory and both information processing psychology and Bandura's social cognitive theory. Although space does not permit discussion of it, Tolman was a pioneer in the currently popular field of behavioral genetics. Tolman was the first to publish a study on selective breeding in maze learning ability in rats. It was Tolman's student Robert C. Tryon, whose name became most associated with selective breeding because of his longitudinal study on maze-bright and maze-dull rats. And in 1937, Tolman served as the 45th president of the American Psychological Association, and in 1957 he received the APA's Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award with the following citation. For the creative and sustained pursuit of theoretical integration and the multifaceted data of psychology, not just its more circumscribed and inimitable aspects, for forcing theorizing out of the mechanical and peripheral into the center of psychology without the loss of objectivity and discipline, for returning the human being to psychology, and for insisting upon molar behavior purposely organized as a unit of analysis, most explicitly illustrated in his purposive cognitive theory of learning. Behaviorism today. For several decades, behaviorism formed the mainstream of American psychology. In addition to the major figures we have considered, there were many other behaviorists. We have mentioned only in passing, for example, Cantor, Holt, Barker, to cover elsewhere, Gibson, Bandura. Even now, the work of all the neo-behaviorists covered in this chapter remain influential to one degree or another. Tolman's brand of behaviorism, with its emphasis on purposive behavior and mental constructs, can even be viewed as a forerunner can even be viewed as a forerunner to the current cognitive psychology. Skinner's influence remains especially strong. In 1974, Skinner wrote about behaviorism, which attempted to correct 20 misconceptions about behaviorism. In this book, Skinner traced a number of these misconceptions to Watson's early writings. For example, Watson's dependence on reflective behavior and his denial of the importance of genetic endowment. Skinner's position rectified both mistakes. Skinner also pointed out that he did not deny so-called mental processes, but believed that ultimately they will be explained as verbal labels that we attach to certain bodily processes. As evidence for the enduring popularity of the Skinnerian behaviorism, followers of Skinner have formed their own division of the APA. Division 25, the division of the division of the experimental analysis of behavior, and have their own journals in which they publish their research. Korn, Davis, and Davis, 1991, asked historians of psychology about chairpersons of graduate programs in psychology to rank the 10 most important psychologists of all time and the 10 most important contemporary psychologists. On the all-time list, historians ranked Wundt first, Skinner eighth, chairpersons ranked Skinner first, Wundt sixth, and on the contemporary list, both historians and chairpersons ranked Skinner first. In another survey of 1,725 members of the American Psychological Society, were asked to rank the most eminent psychologists of the 20th century. In this survey, Skinner ranked first, Piaget second, and Freud third. As far as recognition by the general public is concerned, Skinner is perhaps second only to Freud for his interesting account of how the popular press reacted to Skinner's ideas. See Rutherford, 2000. Despite the many manifestations of behaviorism and neobehaviorism in contemporary psychology, the influence of both has diminished. The overwhelming interest in cognitive psychology today runs counter to most bands of behaviorism, except Tolman's. Contrary to what the behaviorists believed, evolutionary psychologists and others are providing evidence that much animal behavior, including human societal behavior, is genetically influenced. Also, the neo-behaviorist insistence that all theoretical terms be operationally defined became a problem. Even the logical positivists abandoned the strict operationalism because it was too restricted. It excluded the science concepts that were too nebulous to be defined operationally, but were still useful in suggesting new avenues of research and methods of inquiry. If one were to criticize behaviorism, it would not be for what it tried to accomplish, but rather for the things that it found necessary to deny. Fundamentally, it denied free theorizing because all theory had to be limited to observable stimuli and responses. It denied all the common sense constructs without which none of us could get along in the world. Conscious experience, thinking, knowledge, images, feelings, and so on. In fact, it rejected common sense knowledge by fiat rather than testing it, transcending it, as the other sciences had done. Even the suggestion of logical positivism made concerning theory construction eventually fell into disrepute. Perhaps the most important reason that logical positivism ultimately failed was the discovery that it did not accurately describe how science was conducted, even by its most effective practitioners. Individuals such as Thomas Kuhn have shown that behavior of scientists is determined as much by social pressure, pre-existing beliefs, personal biases, and base emotions as by axioms, postulates, theories, and logic. One major legacy of behaviorism and neo-behaviorism still characterize psychology, however. Psychologists are generally agree now that the subject matter of psychology is overt behavior. Today, cognitive psychology is king, but even the psychologists studying cognitions use behavior to index those events. In that sense, most experimental psychologists today are behaviorists. Summary. The positivism of Bacon, Comte, and Mach insisted that only that which is directly observable be the objective scientific investigation. For the positivists, all speculation about abstract entities should be actively avoided. Watson and the Russian physiologists were positivists. Logical positivists had a more liberal view of scientific activity. For them, theorizing about unobservable entities was allowed, providing those entities were directly linked to the observable events via operational definitions. Operational definitions define abstract concept in terms of procedures used to measure these concepts. The belief that all scientific concepts be operationally defined was called operationism. Physicalism was a belief that all sciences should share common assumptions, principles, methodologies, and should model themselves after physics. Neobehaviorism results when behaviorism, with its insistence that the subject matter of psychology be overt behavior, merged with logical positivism, with its acceptance of the theory and the insistence of operational definitions. By following the tenets of logical positivism, neo-behaviorists believed that they could theoretically and still remain objective. Guthrie created an extremely parsimonious theory of learning. All learning was explained by the law of contiguity, which stated that when a pattern of stimuli and a response occur together, they become associated. Furthermore, the association between the two occur at full strength just after one exposure. By postulating one trial learning, Guthrie rejected the law of frequency. To explain why practice improves performance, Guthrie differentiated among motives, acts, and skills. The movement is a specific response made to a specific pattern of stimuli. It is the association between the movement and the pattern of the stimuli that is learned in one trial. An act is the movement that has become associated with a number of stimuli patterns. A skill, in turn, consists of many acts. It is because acts are made up of many movements and the skills are made up of many acts that practice improves performance. According to Guthrie, bad habits can be broken by causing a response other than the desirable one to be made in presence of a stimuli that previously elicited the undesirable response. Attempts to formalize Guthrie's theory, thereby making it more testable, were made by Virginia Vokes and William Estes. Using intervening variables, Hull developed an open-ended, self-correcting, hypothetico-deductive theory of learning. The experimentation supports the deductions from this theory, and the theory gains strength. If not, the part of the theory of which the deductions were based is revised. Equating reinforcement with drive reduction. Hull defined habit strength as a number of reinforcing pairings between a stimulus and a response. He saw reaction potential as a function of the amount of habit strength and drive present. Hull's theory was extremely influential in the 1940s and 1950s, and because of the efforts of Hull's disciplines such as Keith Spence, the influence of his theory extended well into the 1960s. Some particular aspects of Hull's theory is still found in contemporary psychology, but not his comprehensive approach to theory building. Psychologists now seek theories of more limited domain. In his approach to psychology, Skinner accepted positivism instead of logical positivism. He can still be classified as a neo-behaviorist because, although he avoided theory, he did accept operationism. Skinner distinguished between respondent behavior, which a known stimulus elicits, and operant behavior, which an organism emits. Skinner is concerned most exclusively with operant behavior. For Skinner, reinforcement is anything that changes the rate or probability of a response. Nothing more needs to be known about reinforcement, nor is it an understanding of the physiology necessary for the understanding of behavior. Skinner urged the study of functional relationship between behavior and the environment. Because such analysis is correlational, it avoided complexities in determining causation of human behavior and eliminating the need to postulate unobserved cognitive and physiological determinants of behavior. Watson and Skinner were radical behaviorists because they stressed environmental influences on behavior to exclusion of so-called mental events and physiological states. Tolman, Hull, and Guthrie were methodological behaviorists because they were willing to theorize about internal causes of behavior, such as cognitive maps and psychological drives. Many contemporary psychologists label themselves Skinnerians and are active in both research and applied aspects of psychology. According to Skinnerian psychology, behavior is reinforced, is strengthened, more probable, but behavior that is punished is not necessarily weakened. It is best, then, to arrange reinforcement contingencies so that desirable behavior is reinforced and undesirable behavior is not. No matter what type of behavior is under consideration, the rule is always the same. Change reinforcement contingencies and you will change behavior. Instead of studying reflexive or molecular behavior, Tolman studied purposive or molar behavior. Thus, his version of psychology is called purposive behaviorism. According to Tolman, the learning processes progresses from a formation of hypothesis concerning what leads to what in an environment, to an expectancy, and finally to a belief. In Tolman's theory, confirmation replaced the notion of reinforcement, and the important distinction was made between learning and performance. Aspects of contemporary cognitive psychology also have much in common with Tolman's work. Although the influence of behaviorism and neo-behaviorism have diminished in contemporary psychology, some of their basic tenets have been incorporated into all bands of experimental psychology.